The moment someone decides who you are without knowing your name, justice quietly starts keeping score. The breakfast crowd inside Miller's Diner moved at the easy pace of another Tuesday morning in Ashford, Tennessee, where the coffee was always hot, the pancakes were stacked high, and the same familiar faces filled the booths before the courthouse opened its doors. Waitresses balanced steaming plates with practiced smiles, while country music drifted softly from an old speaker near the pie display. Outside, pickup trucks lined Main Street beneath an endless blue sky, and nothing about the quiet town suggested that history was about to change before anyone finished their first cup of coffee. At the corner booth nearest the front window sat a woman who seemed completely ordinary. She wore a simple navy jacket over a light sweater. Her travel bag rested beside her seat, and a folded local newspaper lay untouched next to a plate of scrambled eggs and toast. Her name was Vanessa Brooks, though no one inside the diner knew it. She had arrived before sunrise after driving nearly 200 miles from Nashville, choosing this small diner because she believed the best way to understand a town was to listen before speaking. She thanked the waitress politely, smiled at an elderly couple across the aisle, and quietly stirred cream into her coffee while sunlight spilled across the polished tabletop. Then the front door swung open with enough force to silence every conversation in the room. Sheriff Ethan Walker stepped inside wearing a pressed tin uniform, polished boots, and the confident expression of a man who believed every sidewalk, storefront, and citizen answered to him. Two deputies followed several steps behind without saying a word. Ethan scanned the room slowly until his eyes stopped on Vanessa. His expression tightened. Without introducing himself or asking a single question, he walked straight toward her booth. The clink of silverware faded as every customer watched him stop beside her table. Vanessa looked up calmly and offered a courteous smile, expecting perhaps that he needed directions or wished everyone a pleasant morning. Instead, the sheriff's voice carried across the diner with unmistakable authority. "Stand up, ma'am." The waitress froze beside the coffee station. An elderly veteran lowered his newspaper. Even the cook glanced through the kitchen window. Vanessa remained seated for only a moment before setting her coffee cup down with remarkable care. "Is there a problem, Sheriff?" she asked in an even tone that carried neither fear nor anger. Ethan ignored the question. He studied her travel bag, her jacket, and the government sedan parked across the street, drawing conclusions without evidence and certainty without patience. "I need you to step away from the table," he said. "We'll sort everything out outside." A whisper rolled through the diner as customers exchanged uncertain glances. Vanessa stood slowly, smoothing the sleeve of her jacket before reaching for her purse. "I'd be happy to cooperate," she replied. "May I know what's concerning you?" The sheriff answered by producing a pair of handcuffs from his duty belt. Gasps echoed across the room as conversations stopped completely. Phones quietly appeared above tabletops, their cameras pointed toward the unfolding scene. Vanessa looked at the cuffs, then back at Ethan, her expression never changing. She neither argued nor raised her voice. She simply met his eyes with a calmness so steady it seemed strangely out of place amid the growing tension. Unknown to everyone in that diner, including the sheriff standing inches away, the quiet woman whose breakfast had just been interrupted had arrived in Ashford for a reason far more important than anyone could imagine. And before the morning was over, the entire town would discover that the person they believed held the greatest authority in the room had mistaken true authority for ordinary silence. Vanessa did not resist when Sheriff Ethan Walker fastened the handcuffs around her wrists. She simply glanced down for a brief moment, then lifted her eyes toward the people surrounding her. The room had become so quiet that the gentle hiss from the coffee machine sounded unusually loud. Every customer seemed frozen between curiosity and uncertainty, waiting for someone else to decide what they should believe. Ethan stepped back with the confidence of a man convinced that every decision he made would be accepted without question. "You fit the description of someone we have been looking for," he announced loudly enough for the entire diner to hear. "Until we verify your identity, you will remain in my custody." Vanessa tilted her head slightly. "May I ask what description that would be?" she said with the same calm voice she had used since he entered the diner. Ethan ignored the question completely. Instead, he looked toward one of his deputies. "Search the bag." The younger deputy hesitated for a split second before carefully picking up Vanessa's travel bag from beside the booth. He placed it on another table without opening it immediately. Something about the woman standing quietly before them made him uncomfortable, although he could not explain why. She did not look frightened. She did not look angry. If anything, she appeared more interested in watching the people around her than defending herself. Across the diner, waitress Emily Carter clutched an empty coffee pot against her apron. She had served Vanessa less than 15 minutes earlier and remembered how politely she had thanked everyone, even complimenting the homemade strawberry jam. Nothing about the woman matched the picture forming inside the sheriff's words. An older customer finally cleared his throat. "Sheriff, are you sure there is not some misunderstanding?" Ethan answered without taking his eyes off Vanessa. "Mind your breakfast, Frank. Police business." The old man quietly lowered his gaze. Years of living in Ashford had taught him that challenging Sheriff Walker in public rarely ended well. Several customers exchanged uneasy looks before lowering their own eyes. Others continued recording with their phones, whispering theories to one another. One person guessed she was a fraud. Another insisted she had probably stolen the government sedan parked across the street. Rumors spread faster than facts, and within seconds they became more convincing than the silence standing before them. Vanessa listened without interrupting anyone. She noticed the frightened expression on the young waitress, the uncertainty on the deputy's face, and the satisfaction on the sheriff's. Every detail settled quietly into her memory. She had spent decades learning that the most revealing moments often arrived before anyone realized they were being observed. Outside, the morning remained peaceful. Sunlight reflected from storefront windows while people continued walking along Main Street, unaware that inside the diner, assumptions were replacing evidence one sentence at a time. Then, almost unnoticed, Vanessa's phone vibrated inside her jacket pocket. The sound was soft, but she recognized the pattern immediately. It was not an ordinary call. It was a secure notification that only a handful of people in the country could send. Ethan noticed the vibration as well. "Turn that phone off," he ordered sharply. Vanessa looked directly at him. "I am afraid that may not be in your best interest." A faint smile appeared on Ethan's face, the kind worn by someone who believed he had already won. "Around here," he replied, "I decide what is in everyone's best interest." Vanessa said nothing else. She simply looked through the diner window toward the quiet street outside, where, several blocks away, dark vehicles had just turned onto Main Street with perfect timing and steady purpose. The line of dark vehicles continued moving steadily along Main Street, still far enough away that only a few people standing near the diner window noticed them. Inside, however, the attention remained fixed on Vanessa and Sheriff Ethan Walker. The younger deputy shifted uneasily from one foot to the other before speaking in a careful voice. "Sheriff, maybe we should verify her identification first." Ethan answered without hesitation. "I already know everything I need to know." His certainty settled over the room like a heavy curtain. Vanessa quietly studied his expression, recognizing the confidence of someone who had stopped asking questions long before he stopped wearing a badge. She had encountered that attitude more times than she cared to remember during her years in public service. It rarely announced itself with shouting. More often, it appeared through assumptions presented as facts and authority exercised without patience. Emily, the waitress, slowly approached the table where Vanessa's untouched breakfast had grown cold. She looked from the sheriff to the woman standing in handcuffs before gathering enough courage to speak. "Would you like me to keep your coffee warm?" she asked softly. Vanessa smiled with genuine kindness. "Thank you. I would appreciate that." The simple exchange caught several customers by surprise. They expected fear. They expected frustration. Instead, they witnessed grace. Across the room, Frank folded his newspaper completely. He had watched hundreds of people pass through Ashford during his 72 years, and something about Vanessa reminded him of military officers he had met decades earlier. Calm did not always mean powerless. Sometimes it meant prepared. Ethan pointed toward the entrance. "We are leaving." Vanessa nodded once. "Before we do, may I ask you one question? Make it quick. If you discover that your first impression was incomplete, what will you do?" Ethan gave a short laugh that drew a few nervous chuckles from people who wanted to stay on his good side. "That has never happened." Vanessa lowered her eyes briefly, almost as if she were saddened rather than offended. "There is a first time for everything," she replied. The deputy carrying her travel bag noticed that it felt unusually organized. There were no personal souvenirs spilling from unzipped pockets, no clutter, no unnecessary belongings. Everything inside appeared carefully arranged, though he respected her privacy enough not to disturb anything without instruction. Resting near the top was a leather portfolio embossed with a simple federal seal. He frowned for a moment before looking toward Ethan, who waved impatiently without even glancing inside. "Bring it with us," the sheriff ordered. "We will sort through it later." Outside, several pedestrians had stopped walking as more government vehicles quietly entered the downtown area. None used flashing lights. None created panic. They simply parked with quiet precision along the curb as professionally dressed men and women stepped onto the sidewalk, each wearing an earpiece and carrying themselves with disciplined purpose. Inside the diner, no one yet understood why so many unfamiliar faces had suddenly appeared in a town where visitors were rare. Vanessa looked through the front window once more. Her eyes briefly met those of a man exiting the lead vehicle. He gave the slightest nod, almost invisible to everyone else. She offered no response beyond a calm blink. Ethan mistook her silence for resignation. "You should have chosen a different town," he said confidently as he guided her toward the door. Vanessa answered with the same measured voice that had never risen above ordinary conversation. "No, Sheriff. I believe this is exactly the town I was supposed to visit today." The morning air felt different the moment Vanessa stepped outside. A cool breeze drifted across Main Street, carrying the familiar scent of fresh bread from the bakery across the corner, but the peaceful rhythm that had filled Ashford only minutes earlier had quietly disappeared. People slowed their steps. Store owners paused in their doorways. Drivers lowered their windows as they noticed the sheriff escorting a handcuffed woman toward his patrol vehicle. No one knew her name, yet many had already decided her story. Sheriff Ethan Walker stopped beside the vehicle and looked toward the growing crowd with visible satisfaction. He had always believed that public confidence came from looking decisive, and nothing projected certainty more than acting before anyone else could ask questions. "This is what happens when people think the rules do not apply to them," he announced, making no effort to lower his voice. Several people nodded automatically. Others remained silent, unsure whether they were witnessing justice or simply authority. Vanessa stood quietly beside the vehicle without lowering her head. The morning sunlight reflected softly against the diner windows behind her, while the gentle sound of a church bell echoed from several blocks away. She took a slow breath, not because she was afraid, but because she had learned long ago that patience often revealed more than confrontation ever could. Deputy Ryan Mitchell carefully carried her travel bag toward the patrol vehicle. As he adjusted his grip, a small leather folder slipped partially from one side pocket. He instinctively reached to secure it before it touched the ground. For only a brief second, he noticed several official documents neatly arranged beneath the cover. The lettering was partially visible, showing a federal seal and the word director before the folder settled back into place. Ryan looked toward the sheriff. "Sheriff, perhaps we should review these before we continue." Ethan barely glanced over his shoulder. "Later. We already know enough." Ryan hesitated. Training had taught him that evidence should answer questions before conclusions were reached, yet years of working under Ethan had taught him something else entirely. Questioning the sheriff in public was rarely welcomed. He quietly placed the bag inside the patrol vehicle without another word. Across the street, Emily stood outside the diner holding Vanessa's untouched coffee cup. She did not even realize she had carried it outside until the cool air brushed against the warm ceramic. Frank slowly joined her beside the entrance. "Something about this does not sit right," he murmured. Emily nodded. She never acted like someone hiding anything. Frank watched Vanessa for another moment. "No," he replied thoughtfully. "She acts like someone who already knows how this day ends." At the far end of Main Street, the line of dark government vehicles came to a smooth stop. Men and women dressed in dark business suits stepped onto the sidewalk with calm professionalism. None appeared rushed. None raised their voices. Their movements were coordinated, disciplined, and almost invisible to everyone except those paying close attention. One man quietly checked his watch before speaking into a concealed microphone. Another studied the diner, the courthouse, and finally the patrol vehicle where Vanessa now stood waiting with remarkable composure. Ethan remained completely unaware. He opened the rear passenger door and reached for the handle with the confidence of someone who believed the entire town was watching another routine arrest. Vanessa looked once more toward the approaching officials before returning her attention to the sheriff. "There is still time to ask a different first question," she said gently. Ethan smiled without concern. "I already asked the only question that matters." Vanessa offered a calm expression that almost resembled sympathy. "No, Sheriff," she answered quietly. "The question that matters most is the one you never thought to ask." Sheriff Ethan Walker rested one hand confidently on the open patrol car door, convinced the morning had already unfolded exactly as he intended. Around him, whispers drifted through the growing crowd as more residents stepped onto the sidewalks, drawn by curiosity rather than certainty. Every passing minute added another witness, another opinion, another assumption built upon appearances instead of facts. Vanessa remained composed, her gaze moving calmly across the faces surrounding her. She noticed concern on some expressions, satisfaction on others, and quiet hesitation on a few who seemed uncertain whether they should believe what they were seeing. Years of experience had taught her that people often revealed their true character not during moments of comfort, but when they believed no one important was watching. Deputy Ryan Mitchell stood beside the patrol vehicle, unable to ignore the leather portfolio resting inside Vanessa's travel bag. The glimpse of the federal seal lingered in his mind. He quietly opened the rear door just enough to steady the bag, and once again the edge of the portfolio became visible. This time he noticed another line beneath the seal. The letters were partially covered, but one word stood out clearly enough to make him pause. Washington. His heartbeat quickened. Before he could look any closer, Ethan closed the door with a firm motion. "We will inventory everything at the office," the sheriff said. Ryan nodded, although his uncertainty only grew stronger. Across the street, the dark government vehicles remained parked in perfect order. No emergency lights flashed. No sirens interrupted the peaceful morning. Instead, several professionally dressed men and women quietly spread across the block, speaking softly through concealed communication devices while observing the scene with remarkable patience. One woman studied the courthouse entrance. Another looked toward the diner before checking the time on her wristwatch. Their movements were deliberate, organized, and impossible to mistake for ordinary travelers. Frank watched them from the sidewalk beside Emily. "Do you know any of those people?" Emily asked. Frank slowly shook his head. "No, but I have seen teams move like that before. They are not here by accident." Emily looked back toward Vanessa. The untouched coffee still warmed her hands. For reasons she could not explain, she could no longer picture the quiet woman as someone in trouble. Instead, she wondered whether everyone else had misunderstood the situation from the very beginning. Ethan folded his arms and looked toward the gathering crowd. "Everything is under control," he declared. "There is nothing to worry about." Vanessa listened without responding. Her attention shifted briefly toward the town clock mounted above the old bank building. 9 o'clock exactly. Right on schedule. At nearly the same moment, one of the officials standing near the lead government vehicle received a brief message through his earpiece. He acknowledged it with a single nod before turning toward the patrol vehicle. Another official adjusted the sleeve of his dark suit and began walking across Main Street with quiet confidence. Two others followed several steps behind. Their pace was steady, unhurried, and unmistakably purposeful. Ryan noticed them first. "Sheriff," he said cautiously, "someone is coming." Ethan glanced over with little interest. "Probably reporters," he replied dismissively. "They can wait." Vanessa watched the approaching officials without the slightest hint of surprise. Her expression remained calm, almost reflective, as though she had been expecting this exact moment since she first sat down inside the diner. The distance between the two groups grew shorter with every measured step, and although the town remained wrapped in silence, something invisible had already begun to shift. The confidence that had filled the sheriff only minutes earlier was about to meet a truth that required no raised voice, no dramatic gesture, and no argument at all, because sometimes the most powerful revelation arrives quietly, leaving nothing for assumptions to hide behind. The first official reached the patrol vehicle with an unhurried confidence that immediately caught everyone's attention. He wore a dark suit instead of a uniform, a simple identification badge clipped neatly inside his jacket, and the composed expression of someone who never needed to raise his voice to be heard. Behind him, several other officials stopped a respectful distance away, quietly observing the scene without interrupting. Sheriff Ethan Walker looked at the newcomer with mild irritation rather than concern. "This is an active local investigation," he said firmly. "You will need to wait until we are finished." The man acknowledged the statement with a polite nod. "Good morning, Sheriff. My name is Daniel Mercer with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The words caused several people in the crowd to exchange surprised glances, but Ethan barely reacted. "Federal or not, this is my jurisdiction." Daniel remained perfectly calm. "Ordinarily, I would agree." He looked briefly toward Vanessa before returning his attention to the sheriff. "Today is a little different." Ethan folded his arms. "Different how?" Daniel studied him for a brief moment, almost as though giving him one final opportunity to reconsider everything that had happened since breakfast began. "Before I answer that," he said evenly, "may I ask whether you verified the identity of the woman currently in your custody?" Ethan answered immediately. "She refused to cooperate." Vanessa quietly looked toward him. "I never refused. I simply asked what concern brought you to my table." Several people standing nearby remembered hearing those exact words inside the diner. Emily lowered her eyes. Frank slowly removed his cap. Even Deputy Ryan Mitchell shifted uneasily as the memory settled over him. Daniel nodded slightly. "That is consistent with what our observers documented." Ethan frowned. "Observers?" Daniel glanced toward the officials positioned along Main Street. "We have been in town since early this morning." The sheriff's confidence weakened almost imperceptibly. "Why?" Daniel answered without hesitation. "Because today was the scheduled beginning of a confidential federal assessment involving multiple agencies." Ryan's attention immediately returned to the leather portfolio resting inside the patrol vehicle. Suddenly, the federal seal he had seen made perfect sense. Ethan, however, remained convinced that he still controlled the situation. "Then you should appreciate someone doing his job." Daniel's expression remained courteous, but noticeably more serious. Doing one's job begins with gathering facts before reaching conclusions. The quiet sentence seemed to settle over the entire street. No one spoke. Even passing traffic slowed as drivers noticed the unusual gathering outside the diner. Daniel extended an open hand toward Ryan. "Deputy, would you please retrieve the leather portfolio from the travel bag?" Ryan hesitated only long enough to glance toward the sheriff before opening the patrol vehicle and carefully removing the folder. His hands felt unexpectedly heavy as he carried it toward Daniel. Without opening it himself, Daniel turned respectfully toward Vanessa. "Ma'am, with your permission." Vanessa nodded once. "Please." Daniel opened the portfolio carefully. Inside rested official credentials, travel authorization documents, and a polished identification wallet bearing the seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He looked down only briefly before closing it again with deliberate care. Then, in front of the silent crowd, the assembled officials, the deputies, and Sheriff Ethan Walker, Daniel stood a little straighter and spoke with unmistakable respect. "Good morning, Director Brooks. We have completed the advanced security arrangements exactly as requested. Welcome to Ashford." For several long seconds, no one moved. The sounds of Main Street seemed to disappear, replaced by a silence so complete that even the distant flutter of an American flag above the courthouse became noticeable. Sheriff Ethan Walker stared at Daniel Mercer as though he had misunderstood what he had just heard. Then his eyes slowly shifted toward Vanessa Brooks. She stood exactly where she had been only moments earlier, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, and her composure untouched by everything that had happened around her. The only difference was that everyone else was finally beginning to see the woman she had been all along. Deputy Ryan Mitchell instinctively stepped back, his face reflecting disbelief as he looked from the identification portfolio to Vanessa and back again. Emily covered her mouth with one hand, remembering every polite word Vanessa had spoken during breakfast. Frank quietly removed his cap completely and held it against his chest, not because anyone asked him to, but because respect suddenly felt like the only appropriate response. Daniel turned slightly toward one of the federal officials standing nearby. "Please document the current scene exactly as it stands." The official nodded and calmly began recording observations while another agent spoke quietly into an earpiece. Everything happened with remarkable professionalism. No voices were raised. No one rushed. The contrast between the measured federal response and the confusion spreading through the crowd could not have been more striking. Ethan finally found his voice. There has been some kind of mistake. Vanessa looked at him with neither satisfaction nor resentment. That possibility was available to you earlier, she replied gently. It is always easier to prevent a mistake than to explain one afterward. Her words carried no anger. If anything, they carried disappointment. Daniel accepted the identification wallet from Ryan before carefully handing it back to Vanessa. Director Brooks, would you like assistance? She offered a small nod. Thank you. Daniel looked toward the sheriff with calm professionalism. Sheriff Walker, would you please remove the restraints? Ethan hesitated, aware that every resident on Main Street, every deputy beside him, and every federal official nearby was watching. The confidence that had filled him all morning had quietly disappeared. Without another word, he reached for the key and carefully removed the handcuffs. Vanessa gently rubbed one wrist for only a moment before smoothing the sleeve of her jacket. She made no dramatic gesture, offered no harsh criticism, and displayed no triumph. Instead, she thanked the deputy who returned her belongings and accepted her travel bag with the same courtesy she had shown inside the diner. The crowd watched in complete silence. Many lowered their phones. Others exchanged embarrassed glances as they reconsidered the assumptions they had accepted only minutes before. Emily slowly walked across the sidewalk, carrying the warm coffee cup she had protected since leaving the diner. I thought you might still want this, she said softly. Vanessa accepted the cup with a grateful smile. Thank you for your kindness. Emily's eyes filled with emotion. I wish more of us had shown it sooner. Vanessa rested one hand gently around the warm cup before looking across the faces gathered on Main Street. Kindness is never late, she answered, but it becomes far more valuable when it arrives before certainty. Daniel stepped beside her once again. Director Brooks, the courthouse conference room has been prepared whenever you are ready. Vanessa nodded but remained where she was for another quiet moment, looking at the town that had welcomed her with suspicion before learning her name. The investigation she had come to conduct had not truly begun inside the courthouse. It had begun the moment someone decided authority mattered more than understanding, and every person standing there now realized they had just witnessed the first and perhaps most important finding of the entire visit. The conference room inside the Ashford courthouse was quiet except for the soft turning of pages and the steady hum of the air conditioner. What had begun as an ordinary Tuesday morning had transformed into something no one in town had expected. Sheriff Ethan Walker sat at one end of the long table with his deputies nearby, while Director Vanessa Brooks occupied the opposite side beside Daniel Mercer and several federal officials. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations, and no rush to judgment. Instead, every decision followed the same principle Vanessa had devoted her career to protecting. Facts would speak before opinions. Daniel placed several folders neatly across the table. Our assessment team has been gathering information for several weeks, he explained. Today's visit was scheduled to observe ordinary operations without advance notice. Ethan slowly looked up. You were investigating this office before anyone arrived at the diner? Daniel nodded. The purpose was to evaluate procedures, professionalism, and public trust through routine observation. Vanessa quietly opened one of the folders. Inside were reports from community interviews, policy reviews, training records, and documented concerns submitted over the past year. None of the pages contained conclusions. They contained questions waiting for evidence. She looked around the room before speaking. Public confidence is built one interaction at a time, she said calmly. The events this morning are not the entire evaluation, but they are part of it because they happen naturally, without preparation. Deputy Ryan Mitchell lowered his eyes as he reflected on everything that had unfolded. He remembered his hesitation, the portfolio he had noticed, and the questions he had almost asked. Vanessa noticed his expression. Deputy Mitchell, she said gently, you requested verification before making assumptions. That matters. Ryan looked surprised. I should have insisted. Vanessa offered a reassuring smile. Integrity often begins with small moments. The important thing is recognizing them before they become habits. Across the room, Ethan remained silent. The confidence that had once filled every sentence had been replaced by careful reflection. For the first time that morning, he seemed less concerned with defending himself than with understanding how quickly certainty had overcome fairness. Outside the courthouse windows, residents gathered quietly along the sidewalk, speaking in softer voices than before. The recordings many had made earlier were no longer being shared with excitement, but viewed with uncomfortable honesty. Emily returned to the diner and quietly served fresh coffee to customers who discussed the morning in a very different way. Frank simply folded his newspaper and said, "A badge tells people who has authority. Character tells people how that authority should be used." Back inside the courthouse, Vanessa closed the final folder and looked toward everyone seated at the table. "This assessment is not about embarrassing individuals," she said. "It exists to strengthen public service because every community deserves to believe that fairness is more than a promise." Daniel then distributed a written schedule for interviews, policy reviews, and additional observations that would continue throughout the week. Everything would be documented through established procedures, with opportunities for every employee to participate and respond. No shortcuts would be taken because lasting trust could never be rebuilt through quick decisions. As the meeting concluded, sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows, illuminating the same town that had looked so ordinary only hours earlier. Ashford had not changed overnight, but the people inside it had been given something far more valuable than certainty. They had been given an opportunity to choose humility over assumptions, fairness over appearances, and accountability over pride, proving that the strongest form of justice is often the one that quietly invites people to become better than they were when the day began. By late afternoon, the courthouse doors opened, and the warm light of the setting sun stretched across Main Street. The crowds had disappeared, the government vehicles were preparing to leave, and Ashford slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Yet for everyone who had witnessed the morning unfold, the town no longer looked quite the same. Vanessa Brooks stepped outside carrying the same travel bag she had brought into the diner hours earlier. The only difference was that now every person who passed her knew her name, but she greeted each of them with the same quiet courtesy she had shown before anyone recognized her position. Emily stood outside Miller's diner waiting beside the entrance, holding a neatly packed paper bag. "Director Brooks," she said with a nervous smile, "our cook insisted you should not leave town without finishing the breakfast you never had the chance to enjoy." Vanessa accepted the bag with genuine gratitude. "Please thank everyone for me. Kindness has a way of arriving exactly when people need it most." Frank stepped forward next, extending his hand. "I have lived here all my life," he said. "Today reminded me that respect should never depend on knowing someone's title." Vanessa shook his hand warmly. "If we only respect people after learning who they are, then we have misunderstood respect from the beginning." Nearby, Deputy Ryan Mitchell approached quietly. His expression carried the weight of lessons learned rather than words prepared in advance. "Director Brooks," he said, "I cannot change what happened this morning, but I can decide how I serve tomorrow." Vanessa smiled with quiet encouragement. "That decision is where real leadership begins." Ryan nodded, understanding that accountability was not measured by perfection, but by the willingness to improve when confronted with truth. A short distance away, Sheriff Ethan Walker remained standing near the courthouse steps. The confidence that had once defined every movement had been replaced by thoughtful silence. As Vanessa prepared to leave, he slowly walked toward her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ethan removed his hat and held it respectfully in his hands. "Director Brooks," he said quietly, "I judged you before I ever knew you. That was my failure." Vanessa looked at him calmly. "Every public servant makes mistakes," she replied. "The measure of character is whether those mistakes become excuses or lessons." Ethan lowered his head slightly. "I intend to remember today for the rest of my career." Vanessa gave a small nod. Then today was not wasted. Daniel Mercer opened the rear door of the waiting government vehicle, but Vanessa paused before getting inside. She looked once more across Main Street where people were greeting one another with noticeably greater warmth than they had that morning. The diner windows reflected the golden evening sunlight. The courthouse bell marked another passing hour, and the quiet little town seemed to breathe a little easier than before. As the vehicle slowly pulled away, Emily watched until it disappeared beyond the edge of town. Frank smiled gently before unfolding his newspaper once again, although he never turned a single page. Everyone carried home a different memory of the day, but they all shared the same lesson. A uniform may represent authority, a title may command attention, and a badge may open doors, but none of them reveal the true measure of a person. Character does. Because real justice does not arrive to prove that one person is greater than another. It arrives to remind every one of us that the greatest power we possess is the choice to treat a stranger with dignity before we ever learn their name.